Good evening. So today what I'll be doing is my philosophical service project, and basically the whole point of this is to talk about real world issues, and I'll give examples in logically valid form. I'll talk about whether or not they're sound, and then from there you guys will present to me some arguments based on what we're speaking about, and I'll break that down in logically valid form, and I'll talk about the soundness of your arguments. So I just want to go over what a logical valid argument is and what a sound one is. So a logically valid argument is one where the conclusion logically follows the premises, basically. So that means that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. A sound argument is one that's not only valid, but has all true premises, which makes the conclusion trustworthy, both in structure and content. And so here's an example that isn't based on what we'll be speaking about. What we will be speaking about is drug use, law enforcement, and how we can talk about that in a philosophical way. But here's an example of just a simple example. So premise one states that all humans are mortal. Socrates is a human, therefore Socrates is immortal. That's valid because the conclusion logically follows the premises, and it's also sound because the premises are true. Now let's apply this same method into arguments about drug laws and punishment. So my first argument is that it talks about incarceration, about nonviolent drug users. So basically my first premise states if a person commits a nonviolent act that doesn't directly harm others, they should not be imprisoned. Using drugs is a nonviolent act that does not directly harm others. Therefore, people who use drugs should not be in prison. And I'll just kind of explain, what makes this logically valid. This argument is logically valid because premise one is a principle that's rooted in harm reduction and restorative justice. And premise two is factually true that in most cases, people use drugs for personal use. Therefore, the argument is sound. Argument two is about racial bias in drug law enforcement. So premise one states that if a law is enforced in a racially biased way, then it's unjust. Drug laws are enforced in a racially biased way, therefore drug laws are unjust. And the evaluation of that is the valid structure of it. Premise one it's widely accepted that, in discussions of fairness and justice, premise two is supported by the arrest and sentencing data, which makes the argument sound. Argument three states, it's going to be about the war on drugs and how it causes more harm than good. The war on drugs causes more harm than good. Therefore, the war on drugs should not be continued. It's valid. Premise one follows from the consequentialist, ethical theory. Premise two is backed by research on incarceration and overdose rates and costs of the war on drugs. Therefore, this argument is sound. Argument four is that punishment should be based on intent to harm. So premise one states that only actions done with intention to harm others deserve punishment. The drug use is typically not done with intention to harm others. Therefore, drug use does not deserve punishment. It's a valid argument. Premise one is consistent with moral responsibility, and premise two is true for most personal drug users. They're not taking drugs specifically with intent to harm others. It's kind of just something that happens if it does take place. My last argument is rehabilitation over punishment. If a person is suffering from addiction, they should be offered rehabilitation and not punishment. Premise two states that drug users are often suffering from addiction. Therefore, drug users should be offered rehabilitation and not incarceration. It's valid. Premise one reflects, principles of public health and compassion, and premise two is supported by addiction research. Therefore, this argument is sound. So now I'd like to turn it over to you guys. If you have any arguments that kind of center around what I've just given examples of, let's talk about why you think that, and we'll work together through, what makes your stance, logically valid, and what makes your argument sound.
Okay. Well, the argument that you stated about using not directly harming others, um, the law prohibits drug selling. And
Of
in
course.
order to use, you have to buy. Therefore, you're breaking the law, which I would say, in and of itself, is harmful to society because a civilized society is held together by laws. So, and not respecting these laws is a harm to society.
Cool. Now, although you have a different stance on this, your argument is sound. Uh, it's not necessarily in logically valid form. So basically, to turn that into a logically valid statement, you'd inherently say all acts that involve breaking the law harm society. All drug use involves breaking the law. Therefore, all drug use harms society. You know,
Right.
your major premise is
Mm-hmm.
that all law-breaking acts are harm to society. All drug use is a law-breaking act, and that in and of itself harms society. So it is a valid argument, and it is sound. Yeah. Do you have any others?
Well, yeah, this idea of drug laws being enforced in a racially biased way, I would say no. Enforcement of drug laws takes place in communities where those laws are being broken. And so, if, say, for example, if communities of color are more represented in drug arrests, then that's because they're breaking the drug laws more often than in other communities.
All right, that's fair. I've heard that a lot in person and on the internet. That's a widely held view on this stance. Although it's not sound. Now, just to quickly state it in logically valid terms, you would say all communities that break drug laws will be represented more in arrests. Communities of color break drug laws more, therefore, communities of color are represented in arrests due to more drug law violations. Although it's not sound because drug laws are broken everywhere. A lot of the times things are more centered on, urban communities and more minority led areas. But that it's simply untrue that communities of color are necessarily breaking the law more, and that's why it's so focused on that. The data actually shows that all over the world in suburban areas, whether they're black or white, there's drug use happening all over the place. So that argument isn't necessarily sound. Um,
Okay.
do you have any others?
Yes. This point about drug use is not done with the intent to harm others, so it doesn't deserve, let's say, incarceration.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, intention or not, drug use harms others because drug users live in a community with other people, and there are often consequences for their drug use, whether they intended them or not. Like, for example, with drinking and driving, you can harm or kill someone by drinking and driving, but even if you don't, you're still a danger
For sure.
to other people in the street. So that in and of itself is harmful.
Now that position is 100%. I agree with. I wholeheartedly agree. It's a sound argument. If you were to put that in logically valid form, you would say all actions that cause harm to others deserve incarceration, regardless of intent. All drug users, all drug use causes harm to others. Therefore, all drug use deserves incarceration. But your position is completely sound. All harmful actions are actions that deserve incarceration, whether or not you have intent to. Especially with drunk driving, you can drink, go out, have a time on the town, and get in your car, think you're just gonna get home safely, and you kill somebody. So the intent is really not what's important because things can happen. You can't really plan everything out, but your position is very much valid and sound. The only one that wasn't really sound was your one about the drug use in less fortunate communities, because the data just doesn't show that, and we're always pinpointing the bad parts or the bad areas that we want to kind of victimize and just focus on, really. So You know, when speaking about issues in general, you can always break them down in a logically valid way and kind of say, if X, then, you know, if this, then that, and kind of just understand it in that way. And as far as the soundness goes, it's important that, you know, things follow a certain pattern. That way you're being true to what you're saying, and you know, real life kind of backs that. So yeah, what we've done today is we've just spoken about drug use, law enforcement, and the way that that's imposed on people, the way people use drugs, and kind of the consequences that these things have on the world. And yeah, that's my philosophical service project.
Do you have any?
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to hog the stage, but there are other questions or any other points from the other members in the audience?
Well, I pretty much agreed with what you were saying. And, you know, that was my point at the beginning, that when, you know, there's a law in effect, you have to follow. And so if you go and buy drugs, you're not following the law. And that's why using drugs, even you're not harming anybody else, but you're still breaking the law because you are sort of like encouraging people to sell drugs.
Has like a trickle down effect,
Right.
so to speak. Yeah. What about you, Fred? Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. Buying drugs is against the law.
Yeah.
That's no one was arguing that.
Well, I'm saying if you do things like that, then you kind of contribute to a lawless society. So
That's true. Yeah.
I agree with those points. Very.
Cool.
Okay.
Hopefully you have a better idea as to how you can think about things in the real world, and, you know, break them down just a little bit more, so there's some context. And, you know, everybody thinks a different way. People have different perspectives, and this is how we formulated our positions.
Great job.
Thank you.
Thank you.